Hello, my name is John Parham. I'm a member of the Charlotte, North Carolina chapter of the Piano Technicians Guild. Our chapter has sent you this model that we made out of either pianos that were thrown away already or that were destined to be thrown away. So they continue to be useful as parts of your model. In this video, I'm going to show you how to assemble the model and how to regulate it. Now, the way that you regulate this model is a little bit different than the pianos in the field that you'll work on, because the parts of this model, you have to put them on and they move up and down and they rotate. On a real piano, they're stationary. This model will, however, teach you the functions of the parts, the names of the parts, and how the parts interact with one another. When you finish regulating your model, I encourage you to take it to your chapter so they can check your work, they can answer your questions, they can also show you the regulating tools that eventually you'll need to buy. After a couple of months, I'll send you a survey about the model. Could you put it together? What kind of help did you need? I'd appreciate it if you were to take just a minute to fill that survey out and return it. I'll send it through surveymonkey.com. So now let's take a look at what's inside your box. So let's lay out the parts. You'll find a base, you'll find a baggie with rails in it, several rails and parts, and a smaller baggie, a key stick, and the backboard. The backboard may or may not have the strike plate already attached to it. Let's start with the bigger bag first. Dump out the parts. You may notice that some of these parts are kind of worn. Some of the metal might have rust on it. It's because these parts came from older pianos. But this is a good model to start with. Your backboard will be labeled to make it easier to put together. Your kit will also have one of these two gauges. This is a capstan adjustment tool. The handle also serves as a go-no-go gauge. This is a go-no-go gauge. The dimensions end to end are 45 to 47 millimeters, or 1 3/4 to 1 7/8. The diameter or the width is 5/8 of an inch. This brass rod is 1/8 of an inch in diameter, and this plastic piece is 1/8 of an inch thick. Whichever tool you have in your kit, you'll use it to regulate your model in a few minutes. Let's start with an action rail. All these rails have a hanger bolt, a washer, and a wing nut on them. The action rail has a metal washer. The other rails will probably have a cardboard washer. And that's because this action rail needs to be fairly tight as you start to move things on it. The parts are color coded, so this part, which is the hammer, shank and hammer butt, bridle strap, and catcher, attaches right here. This is the whipping cushion, the jack, and the back check, and the bridle wire. And this is a spoon. All these pieces are called flanges. There's a flange on the whip-in, on the hammer assembly, and on this piece, which is the damper. So the whip-in attaches right here. And the damper, which is color-coded with a different color, attaches right here. Notice the screws are already in the holes where they belong. Best practice requires that each screw goes into its original hole. So if you unscrew all of them, try not to get them mixed up. Best practice also states that you should back the screw out, turn it the wrong way until you feel a little bump. That's the feel of the screw moving in a proper position. And then tighten it. Now let's put it together. Once you have the three pieces put together, it should look like this. Now to connect the bridle strap, pull the jack forward a little bit. Point is, you do not want it to be under this green piece of felt. So with the jack somewhere up here, and this way, rotates to the right, and then do the best you can to stick the point through that hole. Okay, now let's put the backboard and the base together. The base already has the screws in the holes. So remove the screws and attach the backboard. And you can keep your capstan adjustment tool here so you don't lose it. You can see the backboard is made with slots. So all of these rails are going to hook into these slots with wing nuts and washers. And you can move the rails up and down and you can rotate them. So when you first put it together, the model will probably not work. But I'll show you how to regulate the model once you get it put together. Now you've already put together your action rail, the hammer assembly, whipping, and damper. So that goes in this slot. Attach it with the washer first and then the wing nut. By the way, the hanger bolt for the action rail is larger than the other three rails, so don't get that wing nut mixed up. When you put it in the rail, slide it all the way up to start with. Now let's attach the other rails. Let's do the hammer rest rail. Do it the same way. It doesn't matter what order you put these in. The let-off rail goes here. And the hammer return spring rail goes here. Now let's attach your other two rails to deal with the key. In the smaller bag, you'll find the balance rail, the front rail. By the way, this is the balance rail pin. This is the front rail pin. You'll also find several punchings. A felt punching, well, some are larger, some are smaller. The smaller punchings go on the balance rail. The larger punchings go on the front rail. Different models will have a different set of punchings. You may have cardboard punching. You will definitely have a felt punching and paper punching for both rails. So some rails may or may not have cardboard punchings. And attach these rails the way you did the backboard. By the way, some of these models may have 2 screws, some of them may have 1 screw. If your models have 1 screw, You can loosen this screw and you can twist the rail if you need to for whatever reason, and we'll cover that later. Now let's go ahead and put on your punchings. If you have a cardboard punching for the front rail pin, put that on first. Put the paper punchings on next, and then the felt punching is always put on last. The balance rail in this case has a cardboard punching, so put that on first, then the paper, and just like the front rail, the felt punching always goes on last. If you have paper on top, you'll probably have a clicking sound when you play the key. Now let's install the key. The key has a capstan right here. It has bushing cloth inside the mortise at the balance rail and at the front rail. Put it on the balance rail first, lift up the whipping, and you have your key. Doesn't work. Now let's make it work. After you assemble the model, first thing you should do is take a look at the capstan, the way it lines up underneath the whipping cushion. You can see in this case the capstan is a little bit off-center to the right. So move your front rail left and right until that capstan is as centered as it can be. That's the way it should really be in a piano. Now let's regulate your model. Take your hammer rest rail in this gauge. So use this dimension to set the distance from the hammer to the string or strike plate. That dimension is called blow distance. We may have to change it again after we move the action rail, but we'll get it fairly close right now. Okay, close enough. Take the action rail, move it up so the hammer shank is resting on the rest rail felt. Now notice as I move the rail up, this back check moves back. As I move it down, the back check goes forward. When it stops going forward, the shank starts to move. So right at that point is where it should be. Let's check the blow distance again. Blow distance has changed. Pretty doggone close. Alright, still won't really play. Let's go ahead and set the hammer return spring rail. You should move it so the spring engages in this slot on the hammer butt. That spring encourages the hammer to reset or to go back. Still doesn't really play. The let-off rail engages the jack toe, and when it engages, as you push the key down, it makes the top of the jack go backwards. So we should adjust this rail so the hammer stops 1/8 of an inch before the strike plate. It's pretty close right now. We can check it with our gauge. And it looks like that is pretty much right on it. Now let's set the damper timing. The damper should start to move back when the hammer travels 1/3 to 1/2 the distance to the string, or the strike plate in this case. That's why having a metric rule is so much easier to do the math versus fractional. So we are about 47 millimeters. I'm going to round down to 46, just so the math will be easier. Well, it's actually about 48 millimeters, so it's a millimeter off. So half of 48 is 24. So it should start engaging no later than that. And 1/3 of 48 is 16. So 48 minus 16 is 32, which means that the damper should engage no earlier than 32 millimeters and no later than 24 millimeters. That's only an 8 millimeter range where we have to set this damper timing. When you rotate this rail counterclockwise, the damper engages later. When you rotate it clockwise, the damper engages sooner. Let's see where it's engaging now. About 35. Okay, it's engaging about 29 millimeters. It's starting to move about 29 millimeters. The next specification is checking. Checking is the distance between the hammer and the string after you play the note. The catcher and the back check engage. You can move this back check forward and back to change checking. This is how you adjust it. Hold the whipping so you don't stress it. Try to hold it still. With your thumb, pull it back. I'll do it this way so you can see. You hold the whipping, and then you pull it back. That increases checking. You push it forward. That reduces checking. It doesn't take much. That's pretty close. So that's 5/8. So the only other thing we need to do is make sure aftertouch is correct. Remember this acronym, ACL. Aftertouch, checking, and lost motion. Whenever you make an adjustment to aftertouch, you have to revisit checking and you have to revisit lost motion. We haven't covered lost motion yet. We can adjust aftertouch in two ways. The first way is to change the blow distance. To save time, we're not going to use this method. The second way to change aftertouch is to change how far the key travels. The distance the front of a key travels is called key dip. More dip produces more aftertouch. Less dip produces less aftertouch. This is a method we're going to use to regulate your model. Lost motion happens when there's too much space between the jack tip and the hammer butt. As I lightly tap the key, you can see how the jack tip is jumping up and touching the hammer butt, and the back check is moving, but the hammer is not. That's wasted energy in the key. We're going to eliminate this lost motion by leaving the rail where it is and by raising the capstan. So use your capstan tool. It's getting close. There's not much lost motion left now. The jack still has to reset. The jack does reset. If we adjust the capstan too high, let's go ahead and do that. The jack eventually does not reset. So we ran the capstan up too high in that case. So we need enough lost motion where the jack resets like that. Aftertouch refers to how far the jack tip moves away from the hammer butt after you strike the key and the hammer is in check. Look at that space between the hammer butt and the jack. There's a little bit of clearance, and that's all you need. So how far does it go back? There needs to be enough clearance where you can see a little bit of space between the jack toe and the hammer butt. In this case, we don't have enough clearance. The key needs to go further down so the jack can continue to move back. We can do that by either raising the key to begin with, the key height, so it can travel down more, and the downward travel of the key is called key dip. Or we can leave the key height where it is, and we can take out some of these punchings so the key can now travel further down. So let's first add a punching to the balance rail to change the key height. Now, right now, take a look again at the jack tip. It's not quite clearing that hammer butt. Key is higher. So now when we push the key down, we'll have greater key dip. Let's see what happens. We do have more aftertouch. However, every time you make a change to key dip, whether you raise the front of the key by putting a balance rail punching here, or if you remove a punching from the front rail pin, whichever method you use, you have to reset checking. It's way off. That's pretty close. Play the key again and look at your jack. Too much aftertouch. We raise the key height so much that we increase key dip too much. So we could put a smaller punching here, or just for fun, let's add a punching to reduce key dip, to reduce the amount of aftertouch we have at the jack. Remember, whenever we change key dip, what do we have to do? Take a look now. You can barely see clearance. I'll put this white behind it so you can see. So you can increase key height to get more dip. You can decrease key height to reduce dip. And every time you increase key dip, you increase aftertouch. You can add a front rail punching to reduce key dip. You can remove a punching to increase key dip. But remember to look at your checking and loss motion every time you make an adjustment to aftertouch. Now set aftertouch on your model. The Charlotte chapter hopes that this model proves useful to you. And if we can help you in any way, please feel free to contact me. My contact information is on the screen.
Hello.
Good luck.
Absolutely. That last step, it's golden.
It's a doozy.